Ya palangina karati. Mina in Anderson, Waipa Parabana, Trawalawe Palmamarna. Tapulchi Larapana Lumana Tana. Mina Tanapre Palawa Nini Milathina Nika. Katumna Mina Mane Nanawu Ngambri Tiana. Mina Tanapre Muina. Kunyani Tentamali Manani Nipaluna. Mina Tanapre Palawa Waranta Takamuna Milathina Tami Nini Rachi Nara Takamala Rala Kani Rala Lini Rala. Hello and welcome, friends. I just introduced myself and where I am from the northeast coast of Canberra, in the island that has been known for many thousands of years as Latra Wita. I just acknowledge with respect the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people of the country around where we are meeting. I also honoured the Moina people of Hobart, where I live. Their ancestral connections to the spirit mountain, Kunani, otherwise known as Mount Wellington, and the river that sustained them, the Derwent River, otherwise known as Timtamali Manani. Sadly, the Moina people did not survive the Tasmanian genocide. Thank you, Russell, for that excruciating introduction. It sounds like a lot of work. And I'm very pleased to be here. Over my career, I've been very privileged to do many things, and establishing the Lyme Network was one of them. I will talk about some of those issues in medical education, but I wanted to really take a step back and talk about Indigenous knowledges in universities, including in medical education, and some of the global challenges we have in front of us today. I am mostly, in my early career and as a student, was very involved in Indigenous health. At the same time, there was a group of extraordinary, capable Indigenous education activists, including one of them, Chapananga Errol West. Chapananga West was a Palawa man who made a big impact on Indigenous education, both on the island of Lutruwita, but also more broadly across Australia. But he did that in collegiality with a broad group of Indigenous leaders. So Australian Indigenous educational activists such as the Palawa woman, Auntie Patsy Cameron, Gamilaroi man, Colin Burke, Wajabalik woman, Eleanor Burke, Narangini man, Darryl Rigney, the Naranga and Kana and Narangini man, Lester Irabina Bostock, Gamilaroi man, Bob Morgan, Palawa woman, Kay Price, Gubby Gubby and Gungaloo woman, Eve Feasel, Bidai woman, Gracelyn Smallwood, Bardi woman, Pat Dudgeon, and Pukaloo woman, Jill Milroy, and Jara woman, Miriam Bin Salik, and many, many more, pushed educational boundaries and have made an unbelievable impact on Indigenous education. And I've just listed 20 of them. There are more. Last time I did this, I realised there were more in the room. So for those I didn't list, they are just examples of educational activists who pushed boundaries in ways that were quite profound, because many of them did not have the opportunity to have an education themselves. They were revolutionary thinkers, and they contribute to the growth of higher education in Australia for over 30 years, not just for the benefit of Indigenous people. All Australians have benefited from their scholarship. They had a bold vision, a number of ideas about opening up primary school education, early childhood education, university education, and so on. In those days, it was really hard to be absolutely clear where ideas came from. They usually came from people working together. This was not just a local Australian phenomenon. international education leaders also created momentum for change. They transformed university education. I can't not acknowledge Maori intellectuals and university leaders such as Graham Hangawa and Smith and Linda Toa-Smith, who were at the forefront of this revolution. Linda went on to global prominence with her seminal work, Decolonising Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, first published in 1999. It seems just like yesterday. She was not the first Indigenous person to challenge Eurocentric Western thinking, but her impact has been global, and it has transformed thinking across our globe, not just in Indigenous education, but beyond. The leadership and activism of early Indigenous education leaders created a momentum for change. Government figures indicate that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students commencing a bachelor's degree has more than doubled since 2008. Nevertheless, 45% of all Australians in their early 20s have a university degree, compared to 7.4% of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Clearly, there is still work to be done. This year, the Australian Universities Accord Panel are undertaking a generational review of university education. The interim report recommends that First Nations, students, culture, knowledge and researching communities should be at the heart of the Australian system of higher education. Today, I want to talk about the context when Indigenous activists have changed university education for Indigenous Australians. This takes me back to the university world of the 1990s. This is when I first started my university education. I want to reflect on some of the opportunities that we have collectively realised in medical education, and some of the challenges that are being set by the interim report of the Australian Universities Accord. I will conclude that at no moment in our global history have we had a greater need for universities to embrace the ideas that people like Uncle Elra West and many others actually put forward 30 years ago, and continue to transform university and medical education to address some of the global headwinds that we face across the globe. This Indigenous Australians and university education, and this is in part a personal story. As Russell let out, I was born in Devonport. My Palawa family had lived in and around Latrobe since the early 1850s. Our matriarch, Dalrymple Briggs, was born in the Bass Strait Islands around 1808 and died there in Latrobe in about 1864. She was the daughter of Sila George Briggs and Waratamota Tiena, who had traditional ties to Tebrakana, a place just near Cape Portland. Waratamota Tiena was a daughter, through traditional way, to Manalagena, who you see on the screen. Manalagena was a spiritual leader and led the Aboriginal resistance to the genocide during the 7 years in Lutruwita, known as the Black Wars, in the 1820s. Dalrymple survived the brutalities of the Tasmanian genocide to have a large family with convicts Thomas Baker and then Thomas Johnson. Most of my non-Indigenous roots are indeed from convict families and mostly from the north. It is worth noting that the social technologies through which the British Empire transformed Lutruwita into a prison island were also instrumental in the Tasmanian genocide, creating a template for state-sanctioned genocide in the modern era. In the world in which I grew up, Palawa, like many other Indigenous Australians, rarely finished high school, and we certainly did not go to university. Margaret Williams, a Manara Bundjalung woman from northern New South Wales, was one of the first Aboriginal people to complete a university qualification from the University of Melbourne in 1959. My educational experience was very similar to poor white families from the northeast. My father was a farm labourer. We moved around a lot. I went to 8 different schools, lived in 20 different homes by the time I was 18. I was extremely fortunate to have a senior college, university education in Bendigo, which actually provided me with a pathway to university. I grew up in rural poverty. The work of a rural labourer was hard. Dad worked as a seed cleaner in Clements and Marshalls in Devonport. He did fencing, baled hay, worked as a station hand. I, on the other hand, was the book kid. I liked science. I thought I could find a job in healthcare. At the age of 15, I decided to tell my mother that I was going to become a doctor. I can still remember that conversation. Mum's a good Christian woman. In fact, she was crocheting. She dropped her crochet and said, "What the bloody hell do you want to do that for?" It actually made a good impact, So whilst my younger brothers were out making mischief by drinking and playing football, I decided I was going to prove my mother wrong and find my way into university. Many years later, actually the night I graduated, she said she was so sorry for saying that. She just thought that I had set my ambition too high. There were no Aboriginal doctors at this time. I don't think there were any doctors from poor rural labouring backgrounds either, or at least I didn't have any visibility of them. But there was a global history of Indigenous peoples who had graduated in medicine. Many of them made profound impacts on their communities. Dr. Ariane Haiteka was the first Mohawk doctor in Canada to graduate in 1866 from the University of Toronto. The first Maori doctor and Minister for Health, Sir Maui Bomari, graduated in 1899 from Chicago College. Te Rangi Hara, who was also an anthropologist, was the first Maori doctor to graduate in 1904 from the University of Otago in New Zealand University. The first Native American MD was Susan LaFlèche-Picot. She graduated top of her class from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1889. I want to reflect back on that history when I talk about some of the changes that we've been able to achieve together here in Australia. When I landed as a first-year medical student at the University of Melbourne, there were about 15 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students at the university. In the year before, when I finished high school, there were 12 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who likewise finished high school that year in Victoria. I became one of the first Palawa medical graduates in Australian history. The educational world has changed, and it's much to do with some of these Indigenous leaders pictured here who are part of this movement for change. Leaders like Japananga, Errol West, Auntie Patsy Cameron, and the other leaders in the National Aboriginal Education Committee. Set up in One thing I remember about Canberra is hay fever. Set up in 1973, the NAEC was chaired by an amazing woman, Margaret Valedian. First Aboriginal woman in Australia to graduate, I think, with a degree. The NAEC was very focused on developing pathways through school, and in 1982 began to lay the groundwork for the National Aboriginal Education Policy. In the 1980s, the initiative to create 1,000 Indigenous teachers by 1990 was announced. Their activism would and continues to shape Indigenous education in Australia. In his doctoral thesis, Jamalunga Earl West wrote about the possibility of an Indigenous university. He and others accepted that attainment in Western education was important for Aboriginal people, but it was also for them essential to combine Aboriginal cultural knowledge and more with education. His model would be, and I quote, dedicated to recognising and promoting Indigenous Australian cultures and enhancing the intellectual and cultural understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. He emphasised the need to increase participation of Indigenous Australians in university education and the importance of collaborative research and development projects. He declared, and I quote, "It's important to remember that while we want Western education, we don't want it at the expense of our identity or our culture." I don't think that Errol didn't live long enough to see some of the impacts of his work. He died in 2001. But this graph shows that over the 16-year period between 2006 and 2021, Indigenous student enrolments at Australian universities have grown by 152%. The second slide shows unequivocally how the annual growth rate of enrolments is significantly higher among Indigenous students in most years from 2000 to 2021. This promising trend is also and has also been reflected in Indigenous student enrolments and commencements in medical education. In 2013, 261 Indigenous students were enrolled in medical courses across Australia. A decade later, there were, in 2023, 472 enrolments across Australia with 150 commencing students. The number of Indigenous students commencing medical training has doubled in the last 10 years. This is all due to work of all of you. You should feel proud of that achievement. After the decade between 2012 and 2022, the number of Indigenous medical graduates has increased fourfold, from 15 students per year to 59. However, there continues to be an attainment gap, and this must be the next challenge that we seek to solve. How do we improve Indigenous student success? This shows that just over 2% of the domestic commencing medical students are Indigenous in 2015, increasing to 4.3% in 2023. This percentage of the national cohort of commencing medical students outstrips population parity, which is estimated to be 3%. This data illustrates the endeavours to provide alternative pathways for Aboriginal students into medical education has had a very strongly positive impact on improving access and participation. Nevertheless, we still need to address the gap in completion and the gap in student success. This problem is not unique to Indigenous medical students. Data analysed by the Australian Productivity Commission in 2019 showed a significant growth in the number of students attending university across all courses from disadvantaged backgrounds. Yet the data also showed that students from this group were less likely to succeed in university education, and the gap's about 20% in terms of finalisation of university degrees. So this is a challenge for Indigenous students in medicine, but it's a challenge shared by other students from low SES, rural backgrounds and other backgrounds of educational disadvantage. In 2021, Australian Indigenous Doctors Association produced a paper on best practice in student support for Indigenous medical students. On the topic of retention, they identified that Indigenous students reported the experience of attending medical school daunting, alienating, and particularly found, and I'll quote, the clinical setting as a recurrent space where Indigenous medical students experience cultural alienation. And they argue that cultural supports are important for Indigenous students in their placements and across their course. Racism in the classroom and clinical settings does need to be addressed by Australian medical schools. But more broadly, we also need to ensure that Indigenous students are provided with the educational scaffolding and the social services scaffolding to ensure that they succeed. Universities are building a pipeline of high-performing Indigenous students to transition into staff roles. Between 2005 and 2021, the number of Indigenous PhD students has more than doubled to 766 students. Even more impressively, enrolment in postgraduate degrees has more than quadrupled to 4,000 students in 2021. What is most encouraging is that there's a significant proportion of these PhDs and postgraduate students are in the health sciences. So in a generation, and that's why I wanted to really reinforce a very short history of Indigenous participation in medical education here in Australia, unlike other countries, we have really pivoted to ensure Indigenous Australians are participating and graduating from Australian universities, including as medical practitioners. There is considerably more work to be done. However, it is worth reflecting that there are probably several facets to this success. In medical education, my view, there were a number of key factors. I can't discount the activism of people like Errol West and the impact they had on university education in particular, but in particular fields of education such as medical education. But I also need to acknowledge that leadership in medical schools to reform educational pathways and include Indigenous issues in curriculum was also pivotally critical, and a number of people may recall some of the work that CDAMS, the Committee of Deans of Australian Medical Schools, and subsequently the Medical Deans of Australian Medical Schools did to actually ensure that that was not just happening in isolation, that was happening across a network of medical schools. The role of medical education professional networks, such as this one, has also been pivotal to creating a professional community of educators in Indigenous health. Before this network started, most people teaching in Indigenous health did so at some professional isolation. Professional bodies such as the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, who advocated for the professional interests of Indigenous doctors and students, have also played a pivotal role. As has been the scaffolding provided by professional bodies such as the Royal Australian College of Physicians and the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners to create a healthcare educational environment which placed a high priority on Indigenous students and Indigenous medical education. Governments aligned their policy and their resourcing to also facilitate progress on these critically important issues. And finally, international networks created alliances and shared learning. Professional communities were established through bodies such as the Pacific Region Indigenous Doctors Congress in Aotearoa, in Canada, Hawaii, United States of America, and Taiwan. They provided an invaluable way for us to find collegiality and friendship, and indeed enduring friendships that have lasted a lifetime. So this professional ecology has established a playbook that has significantly transformed Indigenous participation in medical education. However, the Australian Universities Accord is going to lift our ambition. The University Accord, which is once in a generation review of university education, will be looking at lifting participation to have a bold ambition of 55% of Australians aged 25 to 34 years with a university degree by 2050. This is a significant growth in educational university participation in Australia. The panel's ambition for substantial growth is not going to come from traditional university cohorts. About 60% of this growth will come from students who have a low SES background, around 53% from regional and remote areas, and around 11% will come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The future growth of Australian universities depends on creating those robust equity pathways that succeed, that students who don't have, who come from areas of educational disadvantage actually succeed and complete in university education. So whilst that's a significant domestic challenge, I think there's even more significant global challenge in front of us. Recently, Professor Rufus Black from the University of Tasmania identified 3 compelling transformation challenges for our globe, in which Australian universities and universities globally must actually focus on. In his words, there are 5 undergraduate generations before 2050. If we're going to meet any of our climate change targets, it'll be those graduates who meet them. So, of these challenges, he identified the need to rapidly escalate our global response to climate change, the need to globally address challenges of rising inequality, and the need to address global inequality. In my view, it is Indigenous peoples and knowledges that are key to addressing a number of these challenges. We don't provide all the answers, but they're not going to do it without us. In 2023, Mr. Justin Mohammed was appointed as Australia's inaugural ambassador for First Nations people. This creates a focus on Indigenous diplomacy in our foreign policy. It is a powerful contribution to ameliorating global and regional volatility, which has been part driven by rising social inequality across the globe. Indigenous Australians have been developing practice solutions for Indigenous health for over 50 years. That set of challenges can also be shared across into other communities of rising social inequality, particularly in our region, in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia. We don't need governments to solve these problems. We need to create pathways of collegial engagement where Indigenous Australians can also work with colleagues from across the Pacific and Asia. Universities can amplify the impact of Indigenous diplomacy by continuing to strengthen our connectivity with other universities, most particularly across the Global South and more generally within other Indigenous populations. Universities foster the exchange of knowledge. They foster the research and education that can draw on the deep experience of Indigenous Australia in health and other fields in addressing social inequality. Indigenous peoples have also, over 30 years, developed a profound understanding of social inequality in our own communities, with some success. Consider the recent pandemic. During the early part of the pandemic, the number of cases of COVID-19 was greater for non-Indigenous Australians by a factor of 6 compared with Indigenous Australians. This impressive result actually resulted from government's early engagement with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-led health organisations to ensure that the pandemic response was mindful of the ways in which we thought it would work in Indigenous communities, including in remote Australia. Over the pandemic, there were higher cases of severe COVID-19 in Indigenous world, but that's probably likely to have come about by the greater burden of chronic disease already in our community. This sort of is an example of how we can contribute to the global challenges of inequality as Indigenous Australians, as Indigenous peoples from across the Pacific. Finally, Indigenous knowledges have a key role in providing ways to rethink the world. I want to provide one example from my part of the world. So this is, recently there was a piece of research published which investigated 2 oral traditions from the Palawa Moini, or the Moon people, as the ancient people in Tasmania were called. One of them was a tradition of how we came to the island. The memory that we had is that we walked from the north. Not a particularly fanciful story, and not a particularly implausible story, but completely incomprehensible to Europeans in the mid-1850s. The other, and this particular piece of research actually began to date that tradition, but also dated that tradition according to a very powerful memory that was recorded in the 1830s when a Palawa elder spoke about a time when the star Moini was at the south celestial pole. He laid down spears in the sand and drew a few reference stars to triangulate its position. This confused Europeans. There is no South Star. There's a North Star called Polaris, but not one in the south. What the Europeans at that time didn't know is that over a 28,000-year cycle, the poles of the Earth wobble. They wobble over a regular cycle, and the position of stars changed. So over that 28,000 years, there was a star in the South Pole. And that star was the star Canopus, or Moini, as our people refer to it, Moini Palawa. It was at its most southernmost point 14,000 years ago. This means that the Palawa tradition is now the most ancient, dated oral history story in the globe. Both the story of walking over the land bridge to Tasmania in a set of stories that talked about the seas rising up and creating an island at a time when my ancestors, the Moini Palawa, actually could point to a South Star, making the first human beings in the globe to discover the South Pole in the sky. That is an ancient tradition that would have otherwise not been known if we didn't bring together Palawa Indigenous knowledges with Western science, archaeology, astronomy, into one piece, into a shared analysis. And that is the power that universities can get right if they properly value and honour Indigenous knowledges, cultural history, and reach a way in which we can understand some of the challenges in climate change that we're all confronting at the moment. It's no longer an aspiration to think about Indigenous knowledge holders to actually inhabit professorial roles where traditional knowledge and ways of learning can be enhanced by emerging sciences and Western sciences in ways that build a shared understanding of our globe. One of my most significant moments in my academic career was in 2015 when the University of Melbourne conferred Dr. Yunupingu with an honorary Doctor of Laws on the ceremonial grounds of Gama in northeast Arnhem. Dr. Yunupingu was the man who opened up the debate on constitutional recognition and sadly was rejected by the Australian community last week. He was a visionary thinker that thought both in terms of his ceremonial knowledge but also understood the impacts of Western law and how to enhance the role in his community through Western knowledge. I'd organised the degree ceremony and event. I led the ceremony in the possum skin cloak for the university, not a great thing to do in northeast Sunderland. I watched Indigenous leaders and academics process past Yolngu dances, academic robes with designs dating from medieval Europe, combining and contrasting exquisitely with Yule colours and designs. It was an incredibly emotional moment. Tears were flowing. For me, it was a humbling moment that transcended time. It was a moment when the ancient Yolngu tradition, law and ceremony came together with the relatively younger medieval tradition of the university. And it was that time I truly understood some of the power of Indigenous knowledges in contemporary university education. I had a glimpse of the vision that others like Jambalanga ROS and many other Indigenous educational leaders actually mapped out 30 years ago. At this time and at this moment in our global history, we can wait no longer. In 1963, Kath Walker, Urundjul Nulakul, published a poem called A Song of Hope. It was an anthem of that generation of activists who led the movement for constitutional reform that removed the race clauses of the original Australian Constitution in 1967. Her words lay the grounds for the next generation of activists that have changed higher education and medical education in Australia. Her words are timely now, given the grief that Indigenous people across this country who voted yes are now experiencing over the loss of the voice referendum. I'm going to bravely attempt to read. This poem's called A Song of Hope. Look up, my people. The dawn is breaking. The world is waking to a bright new day, when none defame us, nor restriction tame us, nor colour shame us, nor sneer dismay. Now brood no more on the years behind you. The hope assigned you shall the past replace, when a juster justice, grown wiser and stronger, points the bone no longer at a darker race. So long we waited, bound and frustrated, till hate be hated and caste deposed. Now light shall guide us, no goal denied us, and all the doors open that long were closed. See the plain, the promise, dark freedom lover, night's nearly over, and though long the climb, new rights will greet us, new mateship meet us, and joy complete us to our new gem time. To our fathers' fathers, the pain, the sorrow. To our children's children, the glad tomorrow. I want to fish. My sister Michelle, who actually did the Lime logo, last week, as the voice referendum was being defeated, circulated this image of the Tamar River. Known in Palawakani as Kanamaruka. For thousands of years, this tidal river sustained and enriched the Moeni Palawa, or the Moon People, as we have called ourselves since ancient times. She reminded us all of a dark moment during the genocide when our matriarch swam across that river with a baby tied to her back, with the sound of bullets flying past her from the white men who were attempting to kill her. And she reminded us, she survived and we are still here. In Palawakani, Paiwata, Plangi Tami Pawa. Long time before, never to be finished. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Monika, thank you.